Chapter 16, Lesson 1, the Transcontinental Railroad. So now we're going to talk about how the U.S. expanded out and took over all that area there and really got people there in a quicker way. So in terms of the Transcontinental Railroad, you can see it's the one that actually is right here that goes across here. And this is the Central Pacific Line, this is the Union Pacific. Now, almost all the railroad tracks prior to the end of the Civil War were this side of the actual Mississippi River, and just that's the way it was. Eventually there ended up being different routes in different places as well, but these here, none of this stuff was here. If you wanted to go west, you went by foot, horse, wagon, or you went by boat the long way around South America. Now, there were some demands to build a railroad, but people thought, no way, that's ridiculous. It's going to be way too expensive and difficult. In particular, had some problems because things like that there were a whole group of people who lived in that area called the Native Americans. Different tribes and nations that basically did not appreciate the railroad. There was also the Great Plains. Those are relatively flat and pretty easy, I would guess, to build on. Then you got the Rocky Mountains. Those decidedly harder to build on. Great Basin is a desert area, and then the Sierra Nevadas, again, really tall and steep mountains. So that's pretty challenging terrain to get through. Now, once the California Gold Rush happens, though, in 1848, then in 1849, just tons of people come out there, and they start more and more push for the railroad because people want to get there more quickly. It also probably a lot the idea of when the war with Mexico happened and Mexican land was taken from Mexico, and all those states like Arizona and New Mexico and Utah and places like that, suddenly that was now part of the U.S., California too. And with that, now they had control of that land so they could actually put a railroad across it. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act was passed, and this offered free land and government loans to build the railroad. And going back here for a second here, you can see this is actually a plot where the green, I think, is the stuff that they wouldn't get according to, it's either the green or the orange is the stuff that they would get or wouldn't get, but you can see that they would end up with these large amounts of land because that's how they were paid, and then they could sell out the land themselves, the railroad companies would. This is how they kind of financed it. So, in terms of that, though, the two companies built in opposite directions. The Union Pacific went west from Omaha. They had a bit easier time. The Central Pacific went east from Sacramento. And this is actually a truss bridge design, this idea of how you would get across these large areas, or these large rivers and stuff like that. It was a huge task, involved thousands of workers. Quite a few who got injured, or some of them even got killed. It was pretty difficult to get supplies because of the Civil War, because people wanted to, make bullets instead of railroads out west. And shipping supplies to California had to go around South America, because there wasn't a way of shipping it yet, because there wasn't the railroad. The workers on the Central Pacific Railroad, they were hard to find because of the Civil War. Oh, any railroad workers were hard to find because of the Civil War, the draft and such. But the Union Central started to bring in immigrants from, or the Union Pacific. Actually, let me correct that. The Central Pacific, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to confuse those two. So the Central Pacific started to bring in immigrants from China. They were cheaper because they provide their own food and shelter, even though they were paid about the same amount. This led to large-scale Chinese immigration, and lots and lots of people. That's why we have a larger Chinese population out west than in other places as well. Accidents were common amongst Irish and Chinese immigrants as well. The Union Pacific hired lots of Irish and German immigrants. They provided housing, made it a little bit more expensive for them. Here they're trying to make sure that the Native Americans don't attack as these railroad tracks are being laid. And it became really a competition because the rules gave land for every mile of track laid. So the Union Pacific had an easier time because they were building flat land. So the idea of it being a lot bigger problem when you have to go through mountains like the Central Pacific did. I had to go through the Sierra Nevadas almost immediately. Now, the last day they built, there was this bet going on when one of the groups, when the Union Pacific group had built 6 miles of track in a day, and the Central Pacific owner went ahead and said, "I bet my group can build 10 miles of tracks in a day." And they did, and this is something that symbolized a lot of the hard work. And you can see what the work is going on here. These are the railroad ties, and then they would put down the actual railroad tracks, and then they'd have to hit in different, for each railroad tie, they'd have to hit in these spikes, these railroad spikes. Now, the railroad had been worked on for about 6 years by the time it was finally finished. May 10th, 1869 was the day the final spike was put in. It was commemorative, and then it was taken out later because it was gold, or at least gold coated. So that changed, but transportation went from being months to about a week, and the cost was pretty substantial, from $75 to about $100 from depending upon what class you went from Omaha to Sacramento. It was loud and comfortable and bad food, but it changed a lot because suddenly you get things everywhere. So it made things like Sears Roebuck possible, and being able to transport a tremendous amount of goods and all over the place relatively quickly, and that changed the United States dramatically.